for this really wonderful conference. I really enjoyed, and still am enjoying it being here. And I also definitely will miss the view. As you probably know by now, I'm an Egyptologist by training and working with demotic texts, and I'm going to tell you some aspects of the writing process of demotic texts. And I will start with the observation that already has been mentioned several times during the last few days, that writing is affected by several influences, like influences that emerge from writing tools, writing support, writing style, sign sequences, layout characteristics, the educational background of a scribe, scribal practice, and proficiency, physical conditions, as well as the circumstances of writing. And I will start with an example. If you imagine to be asked to write the most sacred of ancient Egyptian books, you will probably write them a bit differently than if you would write some graffiti somewhere in the desert. And let's see if it works. Here you see a directive of how to copy the most sacred of ancient Egyptian books, which is given by a Demotic papyrus, which I am currently in the process of editing. And it tells about how, amongst other things, how to copy the most sacred of the Egyptian books. So these are the ones stored in the temple library. And the text tells you how it's supposed to happen. And this was quite an act, because it goes like this. After the original text had been brought out of the temple library, which was a small storage room close to the core building of the temple, the scribe had first to swear an oath, promising by the local god that he will copy the text to the best of his knowledge, and that he will make no mistakes. He then had to copy the text, nevertheless, under the watchful eyes of two other scribes present. And he had also to be at the same time be aware that after having finished the copy, there was another oath to be sworn, again by the local god. And the oath was about the copy he just wrote will be thoroughly checked. And when this oath was taken, there was a check or a collation of the copy in the presence of like the who is who of the temple, that is the scribe of the divine book, that was kind of the big boss of the scribes at the temple, as well as in the presence of the council priests, which were around 5 priests belonging to the highest decision-making body at the temple, as well as the other scribes present at the temple. So all in all, there was probably kind of pressure on the scribe's shoulder while writing the text, as an illustration. And this pressure probably had some impact on the written result, I guess. So, but scribes obviously were also influenced in other cases by other means. And having a closer look at the process of writing demotic, so we already heard, it's the kind of a cursive, or the most cursive form of the Egyptian writing system, appearing rather late in the picture of Egyptian history in the first millennium BCE. So I would like to focus on two particular cases of influences on the process of writing. First of all, the effect of ink dipping, and second, the effect of context on orthography and paleography. And both cases may, I hope, share some light on the question why written texts look the way they do. So to this end, I will first want to take a closer look at the disruptions coming from ink dipping breaks during the process of writing. And scribes obviously had to pick from time to time fresh ink, and the question is how did they integrate these breaks into the flow of writing, right? So many years ago, more than 20 years ago, James P. Allen investigated ink dipping in hieratic letters from the so-called Hekanacht papyri, which were written in the early second millennium BC, so some years before Demotic appeared. And he made an interesting observation because in some of these letters, the ink dipping coincided with syntactic units, while in others of these letters, the ink dipping happened between the intersection between sentences and clauses. And in others of these letters, the dipping moments were distributed differently. So they could also appear within words, for example. And Allen assumed that the difference could be explained by the fact that some of these letters were probably dictated to the scribes, while others were written by the author himself. And in the first case, the dictation units, which can be assumed to correspond to complete clauses or sentences, would have then provided a natural opportunity to refresh the writing tool or the rush. While in the second case, there would have been no dictation units influencing ink dipping. So it seemed to me that comparing ink dipping habits would be worth having a closer look. And I came up with a small study on Demotic text that should allow comparison of the ink dipping habits of Demotic scribes. And my basic idea was to first have one text written by several scribes, as well as by the same scribe at different times, and then compare the ink dipping breaks between the copies. As for the text, one particular Demotic text seemed to be well suited for such a setup, namely the so-called dating formula at the beginning of Demotic contracts. Why? The thing is that quite a lot of such contracts have been preserved, and the structure of these documents is highly standardized. So at the beginning, there's always quite an elaborate and uniform part where the renewal year and name of the current ruler were mentioned, together with a list of several eponymous priests who were active in the cult of the deceased Ptolemaic couples. And during time, there were quite a lot of them. And so I therefore had a closer look at these parts in 14 documents that were written by highly specialized and trained scribes at the Egyptian temples in Thebes, Asyut, Amwer, and Gebelein during the 2nd century BC, when the formula was quite extensive. And so what were my observations? So they're more or less preliminary results that I would like to share. And first of all, they weren't exactly what I expected them to be, because it turned out that objective measurement of dipping frequency was quite often hardly possible, since it was often tricky to recognize the dipping breaks in the texts. Sometimes they are very clear, but sometimes they are barely recognizable, even in the same text. And one reason was poor image quality of the material that I had available. But in other cases, it was maybe also due to the scribes that may have tried to achieve an even ink density and by hiding the dipping breaks. So this was kind of a rough start at the beginning, but then after some time, I still got some results. And first of all, there were differences between scribes, which is not really astonishing. But here you see an illustrative case of two scribes writing the same text some years apart. I hope you can see it more or less. And if you compare these small yellowish strokes in the synoptic rendering of the two copies, these strokes should symbolize and indicate the ink dipping breaks. The difference in frequency is clearly recognizable. So the scribe of the first papyrus dips around 33 times, meaning the 13 times, and the scribe of the second papyrus dips around 33 times, meaning that there's a roughly 1-to-3 relation in terms of dipping frequency. So does this tell us something about writing speed and scribal proficiency? I don't know, but what is noteworthy is that the first copy was written by a highly trained notary, while the second copy was a copy of the original contract written by some unknown scribe who might have been less used to these kinds of texts. Another result was that there are also differences between copies of the same scribe, meaning that a scribe did not necessarily dip consistently. Here's a case of 2 documents written by the same scribe 4 years apart. And as you can see, he dips 10 times in 175 BC, but only 7 times 4 years later. So is this an indication of his increased scribal practice? Again, I don't know, because profiling scribes on the basis of dipping patterns doesn't really seem possible in any case. But still, what's interesting is that the scribe seems to have preferred certain spots in the text when he refreshed his writing tool. And this brings us to a more interesting question, namely the question if there are places in the text that the scribes in general preferred for dipping breaks. And one obvious instance would be, of course, line breaks, given the interruption that occur there or are happening there anyway. And indeed, if we have a look at the line breaks in all of these 14 documents, we see that ink dips almost always occur at the beginning of line. So what you can see here, the numbers are the new lines, and again, the yellowish strokes are dipping moments. And as you also can see, there are some exceptions. And comparing the 2 copies covering 8 lines for the same text each, you can see that the deputy notary in Thebes dips his rush at each line break, so at the upper, the first example, while his colleague, writing some 17 years later on the other side of the river, only dips in about half of the cases. And probably this is due to the rather short length of the lines, which only led to quick interruptions in the writing process, as well as at the same time the probably rather long runs possible with one ink load writing for writing. So that was one observation, but there's still more. The scribes of this small corpus dip almost never within a word. So in 10 out of the 14 documents, dipping within a word is never done or only once. And in the other 4 documents, it only occurs a few times, although the whole corpus consists of over 1,000 words. So quite a lot of words would have been possible to do breaks there. And when dipping within a word occurs, it mainly applies to Greek proper names in the text. Why? This can be explained by the fact that these names were written in an alphabetic way of writing, and therefore consisted of a relatively large number of signs. But 2 observations struck me most. On the one hand, there seems to be a tendency of the scribes to dip in front of the ma syllable in the name of Ptolemaios. At least the ink dipping occurred there in 4 out of 6 cases. And on the other hand, no dipping is ever done in the corpus after articles, with only one exception. Although in all there are around 20 articles in the text, meaning that there were about 280 instances in the corpus where ink dipping could have happened in theory. Maybe this is because of a connection between the scribe's word formation in his mind and the flow of writing. For although the articles were still distinct units on a graphical level in the script, they formed a phonetic unit with the noun that they belonged to, meaning that they were phonologically understood as prefixes. So phonetic articulation may therefore have had a certain influence on ink dipping. And this brings us to one last observation I would like to share before I move on. It's not the end. Similar to the observation made by Alan in the mentioned letters, that there's a tendency, or there's tendency of the scribes in the Demotic corpus that they refresh the writing tool between certain units of content. And when looking at the thematic entries in the list of the eponymous priests, we see that ink dipping happens around 15 times, in 50% in the cases directly at the beginning of the list. It is then less common at the beginning of the following sections, mentioning several other couples of Ptolemaic rulers, and with the Theoi Philopatoris, the number goes up to 50% before the highest percentage is reached with 88% in front of the Theos Eupator, followed by 71% by the Atlophorus of Arsenio II. So what we can see here is there are clearly some spots preferred for ink refreshing that corresponded to gaps between syntactic units and semantic units. Now, it's not very probable that the text under consideration was dictated to the scribes. They were the only ones in charge of these documents and also highly trained. But they probably knew the text quite well and by heart and had memorized it. And since the text is rather repetitive and boring in terms of content, it's easy to imagine that the scribes were muttering the lists to themselves, maybe in kind of a sing-song, structured by clauses. And this kind of setting then would have quite naturally led to a synchronization of the stages of language production and ink dipping. In any case, what you can see is that the scribes were biased to a small degree during the process of writing by the context they wrote. But what also mattered is context, and I hope I still have some time left to have another look at another influence influencing the process of writing. And I would like to discuss yet an effect that takes more or that relates more to the paleographical and orthographical level. And it starts with the general observation that scribes write some words of a language quite often and other words rather rarely, which means that scribes are quite practiced in the writing of certain words, but not necessarily in the writing of others. If you take a look at the distribution of how often a demotic word is recorded in the database of the Thesaurus Linguae Aegyptiae, that is the most comprehensive digital dictionary and text corpus of the ancient Egyptian language, you see that only a few hundred words are tested many times, while the others were only rarely used. And the question is if this distribution you can see here has an impact on the process of writing, or rather what kind of impact it does have. And there's another important fact, because frequent words have an interesting and important characteristic in terms of their length, because there's, as it seems, an universal property of human language that the more frequent the word is in a given language, the shorter it tends to be in terms of the number of phonemes used to articulate it. And as I said, it seems to apply to all languages. This rule is well known as the law of abbreviation in linguistics. And indeed, if we have a look at the relationship between the frequency and the amount of phonemes of demotic words, we also can see that in the demotic language, a weak correlation exists between the frequency and the length of the word. So measuring the number of phonemes of demotic words is a bit tricky. I will abbreviate this part, but in general, you should get the general picture and the overall idea. So coming back to the process of writing, when working with alphabetic writing systems, word frequency and therefore shortness obviously had an impact on writing, since there, at least in theory, each phoneme is represented by one grapheme. But what about the Egyptian writing system, and especially the demotic one, which operates with quite a range of different writing principles that not directly are related to phoneme correspondences? Is there also an urge to abbreviate frequent spellings? Here you can see a list of the most important of those principles that demotic makes use of. So among them is a way of writing where each consonantal phoneme is represented or rendered by a sign. But there's also a principle that I labeled morphemic orthography, where words belonging to the same root were written identically regardless of phonemic differences. And there are also other principles that I won't mention, but what's important here is that the number of phonemes does not always correspond to the number of written characters. So what can be said about the orthography of the most frequent words in demotic? And thanks to the spelling data collected by the Demotic Paleographical Database project, which I devised with two of my colleagues during the last 10 years in Heidelberg, it's possible now to have a closer look at the orthography of quite a lot of demotic words. And having a look at the relation between frequency and the number of signs used in spelling, we get this picture here. And as you can see, there's indeed a correlation between the number of signs used in a word's spelling and its frequency. This means that scribes are urged to spell frequent words more short. But how do they do that? If we take a closer look at the 20 most common demotic words, there's indeed an interesting observation to be made, since scribes seem to prioritize certain graphemic principles with these words. As you can see, these words tend to be phonematically short. The first 10 only consist of one phoneme each. But interestingly enough, they are also graphematically short, being spelled by only what you would consider one demotic sign. So the determinatives or classifiers are not used in any case, and there are also no phonetic complements or the like. And what's even more interesting is that most of these signs developed out of groups of signs that became ligaturized. So, for example, the second most common sign you see here, the sign for the definite article pa, originates in two birds that were written separately in earlier times in hieratic, but they merged into one graphic unit in demotic times. Now, the reason for this can probably easily be explained by the predictability of frequent words, or some sort of a priming effect that where a certain stimuli activated some memory content. And what I mean is, if you have a rough idea of what should be said or written in a particular place in a sentence, it doesn't really matter if the person speaking to you articulates the word in question somewhat unclearly or only says half of it. The context allows you to guess the word in question, and the same is probably true for writing. So you can abbreviate certain things in certain contexts. So I'm almost done. In light of these considerations, it would be, of course, be interesting to know if the same applies to signs, the demotic signs. And as you can see here, my last slide, demotic scribes are in fact also highly trained in writing some signs and use others only rarely. And so the question would be, do the most frequent signs also tend to be shorter or simpler than the others? Which would totally make sense, of course, but it's the question of how to measure the degree of abstraction and simplicity of a demotic sign shape, which can, at least for now, not easily be done with the tools currently available. And I hadn't had time to have a close look into that. So maybe in a few years' time, we will know more about that. And with that, I'm sorry I took so long. I will finish. Thank you for your attention.